All right, great. Well, let's dive right back into looking at the background context. Today we've been going through, of course, the exercise in Haggai, or technically, I think you would pronounce it Haggai, be the actual pronunciation in Hebrew, but that's a little harder to do. So Haggai is sort of the way that at least the English we've pronounced it. How do you guys pronounce it? Haggai? Same.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes,
the
correct.
same. I got it.
Yeah, some people call it Haggai. I've heard different. Haggai, uh, but I think technically it's Haggai, Haggai, something like that.
A guy,
Haggai's
a
fine. It's
guy.
easier to say. But in any case, we've been focusing on that as our example, of course, looking at the background context and kind of digging in pretty deep to some of that. So what I thought today, hopefully you guys had time at least to read a little bit, read through it again. But rather than us reading through it all together again, I thought we'd just dive right into um, the where we left off last time. The background context, and here's of course, the book, the letter. It's not very long. But if you remember the structure of the book, I think it's laid out fairly clearly. Really, it's structured by four messages, and I guess I should hit share before I. Sorry about that. It's structured, with four messages, so I think it's easy to follow in the sense of how it's laid out. Of course, and each message given a very clear, uh, explicit statement of when it's delivered. And I think that's important in considering the time frame and looking at, as we talked about last week when we looked at Ezra, even Daniel a little bit, and then Zechariah, and just sort of combining those together, got an idea of the historical background, the history, the point in time. And here we realize that these events are taking place in the second year of Darius. And remember, he followed. I think he's the second or third king, technically the third king after Cyrus, but Cyrus's son only lived, I think, about 8 years after Cyrus died, and then I think it was uh, his brother or Cyrus's other son took over, but didn't last more than a year. But then Darius became king around 520, sorry, 522 BC. How do we know that? Well, there's extra biblical records. You know that the pagan kings, particularly the kings of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, they were very careful to keep records. If you remember, there's one example in the book of Esther. You remember Esther? And you remember who was the king at that time in that book?
Ahasuerus.
Yeah, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, who was the one that followed Darius, by the way. Xerxes was king, and if you remember in that book, what was when there was that uprising and the assassination attempt? Do you remember what they did after that? And when they, um, Mordecai, right? He uncovered that plot. And then, do you remember what it says in the book of Esther? What happened after that plot was uncovered, and then kind of time went on, but they did something at that point. The king did something. Well, my question is probably not a good question. Because later, let me ask it this way. Do you remember what later, when the king was restless, he couldn't sleep? Do you remember what he did?
Mm-hmm.
What did he do?
Yeah. You look back at the chronicles or the history, and saw what was decreed about about Israel?
Yeah, you remember he was, let me see if I can find it.
Or the plot
Sorry.
to kill him. It was a plot to kill the king.
Oh yeah,
And
that's right.
there was someone who helped Mordecai, but
Haman.
Yeah.
then he was not rewarded, and then they discovered that they had to he was not even given any recognition for saving the king's life
Mm.
during that assassination plot.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And if you remember, they had actually had written, I'm looking for it right now. They had written down, they had chronicled those events. Here it is. Here it is. Okay, I just wanted to look it up directly so that we can see it there. Notice here in Esther chapter 6. Renee, let me have you read just the first 3 verses here. Esther 6.
Yes, Pastor Tim. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Big Hannah and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him."
And then it goes on to describe how Mordecai was honored. Irony there with Haman having to give him that honor. But notice the king read from the book of records, or the chronicles, or they were read to him. And this is just the evidence of the fact that these kings would keep detailed records. So even this particular assassination attempt that had taken place back earlier, I think it was in chapter 2 or 3. Yeah, chapter 2, sorry. And this is where they found out the event. The plot was investigated and they were hanged on the gallows. It was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now, this is not the book of Chronicles in the Bible, but rather this was the king's records, or they call them the Chronicles of, probably in this case, they'd be the Chronicles of Persia. But you can find, we've actually found Chronicles of Babylon, Chronicles of Assyria, and they're just written records by these pagan kings of different events. Now, of course, they would embellish often, right? Their victories and how great they were and all of that. But they actually do serve. There was much that was accurate, though, and they serve as a great way to figure out the dates and the actual time periods of different events in the histories of these kings. And so we've been able to pretty accurately identify particular dates, especially of when the kings were alive. And that's where we get, 605 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar, began to defeat all the nations around him. And so there are some fixed dates. That's how we get the years. And then, of course, we're able to, the Bible's the only inerrant accurate record, but taking biblical accounts and then seeing when at times there's events described in these chronicles that sometimes they can be connected to the biblical record. And so that's why we can get a fairly accurate idea of a lot of these dates. So when we talk about, King Cyrus reigning until 530 BC, and then his son until 522, and then Darius comes on in 522, that we can be pretty confident that date's fairly accurate, and it's consistent with, you know, as we go on in time, the biblical record. And then, of course, Xerxes follows Darius. That's Ahasuerus, and then Artaxerxes, who was king at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, he followed Xerxes. And so, anyway, I just wanted you to be aware, if you weren't, that there's extra biblical records that are actually very helpful. In fact, there's a very interesting account in the Babylonian Chronicles about King Nabonidus, who was King Nebuchadnezzar's son. He's not mentioned in the Bible, Nabonidus, that is. Nabonidus is the one who followed Nabonidus. No, I'm sorry, Nabonidus was not his son. He was, I think, a general. I forgot what happened to Nebuchadnezzar's son. But Belshazzar, Belteshazzar, which one was it? Was Daniel Belshazzar or Belteshazzar? I forgot. But
Belshazzar.
was that Daniel Belteshazzar?
No, Belshazzar. Daniel was Belshazzar. The king who was the handwritten was
Belteshazzar.
Belteshazzar.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I get confused, you know, they're so close. But he was actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. But there's this guy Nabonidus who was in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belteshazzar, who they found a small fragment of a prayer that he did, the prayer of Nabonidus. I don't know if I told you guys about this in class or not. If I did, just pretend I didn't. Act surprised and amazed or something. But this guy, they found a fragment of this prayer that's called the prayer of Nabonidus. So just a few, it's like a paragraph or so. And they don't even have the full prayer. But in the prayer, he writes down about a time period where he like went crazy. And so, you know, these secular scholars or liberal scholars, they look at this prayer and they say, oh, Daniel 4 actually must have happened to Nabonidus, not Nebuchadnezzar, because there's no record of Nebuchadnezzar, you know, losing his mind in the Babylonian Chronicles. And so they say, well, the Babylonian Chronicles are, you know, they include every event, you know, and so certainly if Nebuchadnezzar had lost his mind and went crazy, it would have been in the Chronicles. And so they dismiss Nebuchadnezzar, you know, they dismiss Daniel chapter 4 based on that. And so then they find this fragment of this prayer of Nabonidus, and there's like, he talks about, you know, his mind was crazy or something. So, this must be Daniel. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, it was Nabonidus. And because again, they say that the Chronicles didn't have this. Well, what's interesting is during the period of time, there is a period of time of 3 to 4 years where the Babylonian Chronicles are silent in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Like there's nothing written about. I think it's a 4-year gap or something like that. There's nothing there about it. And I find that really interesting because actually, if you look at the Aramaic in Daniel 4, it says, you know, normally we say 7 years. It's actually 7 seasons. It's the word for seasons. So it's really probably like 2 years, something like that. But what's interesting is that would fit right inside that gap of time that's missing in the Chronicles. And of course, right, what king would write about, you know, in the Chronicles anyway, what king would talk about, you know, when he went crazy and ate grass like a cow. But it was kind of an interesting, why did I bring this up? Well, because I thought it was interesting, but I just wanted to, it's interesting that because the Chronicles typically are very detailed, and so some liberal scholars say they expect these Chronicles to be detailed, and because there was no record of Nebuchadnezzar eating grass like a cow in the Chronicles, they say, well, that must not have happened to him. but you know, there is a gap in the Chronicles that would fit in the record we see in Scripture. And of course, in Scripture it says it happened, so we know it did. And even then, Nebuchadnezzar probably wouldn't write about it because it was a pretty embarrassing event for him. But nonetheless, these chronicles serve as a really helpful resource in connecting dates and sometimes even events that take place. And the chronicles were not always written on tablets. Some of them were chronicled on the faces of mountains. The one famous one is called the Behistun inscription, and it's this inscription written on this massive mountain face, and I can't remember now which king did it. I want to say it was it Sennacherib? It's one of those guys, but he actually wrote his chronicles on the face of a mountain, some of them, and it was like, you know, his great victories and all of this. What's very interesting, you can look this up, the Behistun inscription, is that actually that was one of the findings in the 1800s that unlocked the ability to read cuneiform, the ancient script used by the Assyrians and even later the Babylonians. And so that it's kind of like the what's that Egyptian one, the that helped us to understand hieroglyphics, the Rosetta Stone. Remember that? This was kind of like the Rosetta Stone for cuneiform, and it's like this huge mountain face in Syria, where this guy wrote his record. But anyway, that probably not going to help you in your study for your sermon this week. But I just thought it's kind of fascinating to me, just a lot of these things. And sometimes, I don't know, I've wondered, like, how do they get these dates? You know, how can we be confident that they're accurate? And well, a lot of it's come from the extra biblical records that, in many cases, you know, are pretty helpful, fairly accurate, and I think give us those, you know, calendar dates anyway. So once we know like a reference point of the year a particular king reigned, that we can link it to these records and then be able to map out or identify the years relative to, you know, the before Christ or after Christ in that regard. So all that to say, back to what I launched from was these particular dates here that Haggai gives us can help us pinpoint the exact date of each of these four messages. And did you have any questions or comments about all that stuff I mentioned? I don't want to just blow through that. If you had a question or comment or something that you thought about. Yeah, Robbie?
No, I was just wondering why chapter 1 verse 13 was not counted as one of the messages. Was it just because it was so short, I'm with you? It's a sort of an encouragement.
Oh, you mean in Haggai?
In Haggai, I'm sorry. Yeah. Because he spoke again for the Lord, and the Lord just simply said, I'm with you. So maybe I was just wondering if, because it's so
you mean
short and
on verse 13.
verse
Why
13,
that wouldn't
yeah.
be considered another message? Yeah, I mean, I guess technically we could say that it's a fifth one, but it's so like it's just
So short.
it's very short, right? It's just a few words.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you know what? That's a good point. Maybe technically we could say there were 5 messages that But this one, the reason I didn't sort of put it at the same level as the others is that notice the others, excuse me, sort of had this different formula. The word of the Lord came. I think each of the other messages has that. The word of the Lord came.
Mhm.
The word of the Lord came. And then the last one, the word of the Lord came. So that sort of had that formula. Whereas where you're talking about, it just says Haggai spoke by the commission of the Lord. So, I mean, it technically is a separate message, but it doesn't have that same sort of introductory formula that we see for the other four messages. So that's why I sort of just incorporated it into, and also too, each of the other ones, it says it gives the date, and then it says the word of the Lord came, right?
That's right.
Message 1, message 2, on the date, the word of the Lord came. Message 3, on the date, the word of the Lord came. Message 4. Message 4, even though it was the same day as message 3, it's still, he gives the date. The word of the Lord came on. So, so yeah, I would agree with you in that technically it is a message, but not sort of at the same, with the same sort of structure and introduction as the others. But that's a good observation. Oh, here, I wanted to show you this. I'm sorry, guys, if this stuff bores you or whatever, you just have to put up with it with me. But I just think it's kind of cool when some of these discoveries here, if I can. Whoops, what happened to it? Oh. I had found a picture here of the inscription. I just wanted to see if I can pull it up. Here we go. Oh yeah, that's a better. Let me see. I'll just pull this over. Can you see it on the screen there? This is the inscription. All of this here is different. It was written in 3 different languages, and so they understood. They were able to follow one of the languages. Let me see if there's another. Here's another kind of clear picture. So it's got, which king was it? Let me see. I know you guys can look this up, but okay, it was Darius. It's King Darius, our King Darius. He's the one who had it written. And it was in Persian and Akkadian. It unlocked the Akkadian or cuneiform. And so these pictures sort of show, look at it, it's like on the side of a mountain. And the thing is like, I think the distance of this thing is like 15 or 20 meters. Here. So you can see it there. It's like on the side of a mountain. It's like 15 meters high, right? 45, 50 feet high. And so what this guy did, the guy who discovered it, he, let's see if there's a picture of the top of the mountain. Yeah, so look at this. So the guy, this is back in, the late 1800s, he tied a rope onto a rock and he climbed down the rope so he could get close enough to see the inscription and translate it. So the guy's hanging on a rope for weeks, just going across, reading, translating this inscription. because he wasn't able to get a camera position to take a picture. So he just went up, and here's a good close-up above the head of this king here. This above the head of this king here is this, whoops. Is you can see the inscription there right above his head to get a close-up. I don't know. That's kind of cool. So of course Darius was the one who had this commission. So guess who this guy is, the tallest one in the picture. Right? Darius. They always had to be the biggest, most prominent picture. And I honestly, it's been a long time since I studied this, but I don't remember what this entailed. I think it was, one of his victories. But so this is kind of interesting, and it is in a sense connected a little bit to what we're talking about here, because we're looking at this account in Haggai in the reign of Darius. So this is the same Darius. I'll include a couple pictures in the notes, but it's kind of interesting. Again, I really am always fascinated when archaeological discoveries sort of intersect with the biblical record. Just that the Bible doesn't need anything to prove itself, but it is kind of neat when we find things like, oh, here's that guy Darius, and we know about him from Scripture, from Haggai and Zechariah, and he's also mentioned in Chronicles, I think. But all that to say is, looking at Haggai, we can see sort of in the second year of Darius, these 4 messages are given. They pinpoint the exact time, and that is helpful, again, because as we talked about last week, Zechariah's messages overlap at the beginning of his ministry with Haggai's, right? Which makes sense given the biblical record from Ezra. And as we note the structure of Haggai and these 4 messages, 4 prominent main messages that Haggai delivers, he delivers them within, notice, from the first day of the 6th month to the 24th day of the 9th month. So we're looking at, right, just under 4 months where he delivers these particular messages. And I think it's helpful to sort of ask ourselves the question, why these messages? Why did Haggai record these messages? Were they the only ones that he spoke? And in these 4 messages, was it just what is written here, or was there more that Haggai said? We don't know those things for sure, but what we do have is what is recorded. And so what's interesting is, again, you think about, oftentimes these prophets, if you look at all the messages of all the prophets, they were often much longer than what Haggai has given us here, right? If you go to many times, they would be much more extensive. So, my tendency is to think these are probably the core statements within the message that he gave. But, that's just my opinion. At the end of the day, at the bottom line is, though, these are what the key thoughts that Haggai wanted to communicate, and they were the parts of the message that he wrote down for his readers later. But all that said, let's keep going here. So going through those 4 messages, going through the book of Haggai, where we have, again, the 4 messages, and included in that is the response to the first message, where the people did begin construction again. We then take a look at, in the background context of the book, identifying, each of these key elements in the background context. The first, of course, being the prophet, Haggai, and we spent time back in session 73 going through him in detail, as well as the audience. We started on that with Zerubbabel in session 74. And so what I wanted to do was pick it up with with Joshua, because remember, each of these messages wasn't just generally directed to all the people, right? If you remember, going back to the first message, it is to whom? Zerubbabel and
to Joshua.
Yeah, right? That's the first message. It's directed to those two guys. The second message was directed to Zerubbabel and
Joshua
Joshua
and the remnant
and the remnant. So the people are included in this second message. And then the third message is directed to the priests.
And
then the fourth message is directed to Zerubbabel. But notice the first two messages, Joshua is explicitly, directly identified as a recipient of those first two messages. And so he would be considered, I would consider him part of the direct audience. He is in two of the messages. And so we would want to understand and study a little bit about him. Zerubbabel, we spent some time I think it was before we had our break, where we looked at him in detail. So I wanted to spend a little time this morning on Joshua. What do we learn about Joshua from Haggai? So maybe if you guys want to give some input, what's some things from the book of Haggai that we learn about Joshua? Anybody?
He was the son of Jehozadak.
Yes.
And he was the high priest.
Son of Jehozadak. And he was the high priest.
The high priest.
Which is mentioned in Ezra, I believe, as well, right? When it talks about them coming over. And in this book, I think every time that Joshua is addressed, it says that. Whoops. Let's go back here. So in verse 1, chapter 1, and then notice verse 12, Joshua, the son of the high priest. And then verse 14, Joshua, the high priest. So I think every time he's referred to the same way. Which is interesting. Okay, anything else that we know about this guy? What else is revealed about him? Or does anything outside of Haggai come to mind that we know about him? One thing that I like to do, I'll pull it over here, I find it helpful is to go to Bible Hub and just, this is a quick way to do cross-referencing. Hit topical. Let's go to Haggai, hit topical. And then Joshua will be listed here, as well as Jehozadak, his father. And we can just hit hit the link and we'll get all the occurrences of Joshua in the Bible. Now, of course, we're going to ignore the ones from the New Testament because that's, and also the ones from Exodus because that's another Joshua. But we can look and identify eventually. He's mentioned in a lot of places. Wow. He's mentioned a lot, Joshua. This may not be the quickest way to do this. Where are the other? Oh. It may be better to use, are you guys are familiar with treasury scripture knowledge, right?
Yeah.
That might be a quicker way to do this. Unless you have, if you have like the Strong's Concordance.
Yeah, he was a grandson.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
He was the grandson of the high priest Hilkiah.
Yeah, if you go, I think
Yeah.
I think he's mentioned in Chronicles, right? First Chronicles 6. Yeah, here's Sariah became the father of Jehozadak. This is First Chronicles 6:14. So we learn in First Chronicles 6:14 that Sariah was the father of Jehozadak. And who is Jehozadak?
The father of Joshua.
Exactly. And what does it say here about Jehozadak went along when the Lord carried Judah and Jerusalem away into exile? See that?
Yeah.
So Jehozadak, so what does that tell us then about Joshua? When was he likely born?
During the captivity.
Yes.
During the captivity.
So Joshua was born in the captivity, which would make sense because if he had went in, he'd be like really old by the time we're looking at the book of Haggai. But we're given a little bit of information here, and then also too, if we go, I think, to Ezra. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there was another fact. I think Sariah, if you look in 2 Kings, I found this reference, 25:18. Here's Sariah, the chief priest, okay? So we know this is grandfather of Joshua, right?
Yeah.
Because this took place here. This was at the time of the third siege by Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, there was 3.
Yeah.
There was one in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar in 605. Then there was one in was it the 9th year in 597, and then there's one in the 19th year. This is 586 BC. And at this time, this is when they totally wiped out the temple, took everything out of it, burned it. But what also happened is Sariah, who was the high priest at the time, was taken and put to death. So that's the 2 Kings 25:18 to 21 tells us that Sariah, again, this is Joshua's Lolo. was the high priest when Babylon destroyed the first temple around 586 BC. So think about this, guys. And then he was killed. So who is it? Okay, so Sariah was there when the Solomon's temple was destroyed, right? That's what we find here in 2 Kings. And Sariah was killed at that time. Sariah's son, Jehozadak, was taken into captivity. And now, and then presumably he'd be the high priest, even though there wasn't any, temple, of course, but he would still be considered the high priest. And now, who is it that comes into the land and is commissioned by God to rebuild the temple? Right? His son Joshua, whose own grandfather was the one who was there when Solomon's temple was destroyed. Now the grandson, Joshua, is given the responsibility to make sure it gets rebuilt. So you wonder, what stories perhaps his father told him as he was growing up. Anyway, just something to think about on the side. Because we learned Jehozadak was spared, of course, because he was brought into Babylon during the captivity, during probably the third siege here is when that happened, as it says in 1 Chronicles 6. And then we learn in Ezra 3 that Joshua, or Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brothers, the priests, they all came and they went in that first wave back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the altar. And then celebrated the Feast of Booths. Okay, so how can this, let me just take note of this. So how can this be helpful to us, learning these details? What could be the significance or help to us as we study the book? Any thoughts about that?
It would give us the sequence of events that are the background to the messages that God would speak through the prophet. And so it gives the messages a particular context to what was happening behind those messages.
Yes, certainly, right? It definitely gives us a background to, because there are, again, one of the primary recipients is Joshua, isn't he? And if you think about the book of Zechariah, there's Joshua appears in one of the visions in that book. Do you remember? You guys remember? I don't know if one of you got assigned that passage or not for the preaching lab.
Zechariah 3.
Yeah, Zechariah 3. And you remember that it was the picture there of Joshua, the high priest, in his priestly garments, and they were covered with filth, and he was standing next to the angel of Yahweh and the accuser, right? And but all of that's important to understand. This guy Joshua was, the actual high priest. And that vision was a significant vision in the series of visions Zechariah had that was used to encourage the people to rebuild. And in that particular vision, Joshua, remember his filthy garments, the angel of the Lord took them off and put clean garments on him. And that was, a picture of Israel and all of those things. But understanding, who Joshua is critical to being able to understand that particular vision. But it's also important to recognize in the book of Haggai that Joshua as the high priest represented, he was the religious leader, right? He was at the top as far as the leading the people in the worship of Yahweh, right? As the high priest, he played that very important role. So it's helpful to understand and learn a little bit about him, even though the process can be a little bit, tedious, and you're trying to look up verses and things like that. But I think, as you guys know, as we've done many times in many books, many passages, trying to find out as much information you can about the people involved can provide some very helpful insights. Sometimes it's just information, but again, think about what do we try to do when we study the epistles? We try to enter into the world of the author, don't we? That's one of our goals, right? What was going on? What was he thinking? Who are these people that he's talking about? What was happening? Well, it's the same, here in this book. These are real people and they're real situations. So here you have a guy, Joshua, who's the high priest. He has a responsibility as a spiritual leader, and his grandfather was killed at the time when the temple they're called to rebuild, that temple, his grandfather was there and saw it destroyed and was killed. Now that brings a little bit of personalizes it a little bit, doesn't it? And I think would help us appreciate sort of the role that Joshua has here, and even God's grace in sort of giving Joshua the opportunity to lead the people in this project that he has a very personal connection to, as far as his family is concerned. So I think it brings some, what do you call that? Not reality, but I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for here. Humanizes, maybe helps us connect better a little bit from a personal standpoint to what's going on here, because it's real easy to distance ourselves from these Old Testament prophetic texts, but we have to remember there's, these people had lives and they had personal situations that I think sometimes we tend not to think about when we study these books. We could say the same for Zerubbabel, right? Because remember, he was in the kingly line, right? The kings of Judah. Remember that? We studied him before. And so remember, his relative had his eyes gouged out by the king. And so he has a personal connection, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed and when his ancestors were mistreated and abused, tortured, even killed. And now he's put in this position to lead the people to rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed at the hands of the one who had, committed violence against his family. Sorry, Robert, were you going to say something?
Yeah. I can just imagine, because you were just mentioning earlier how it personalizes the narrative. I could just imagine the sense of mission that Joshua had in the rebuilding, especially having been mentioned that he was the son of Jehozadak, who probably saw his father killed, Sariah, and who never really fully attained um, the high priesthood because of the captivity. So I'm just imagining how he is passing this on to his son Joshua when it was decreed that they would go back and rebuild the temple.
Yeah, I mean, to imagine what he had heard growing up, and this is the significance of this event, I think, is when Cyrus released the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. I mean, how significant was that in the course of their history? Because right, they were in captivity, and normally that's it, that's over, right? You're stuck, you're going to be enslaved for as long as the powers that be can keep you that way, right? The Egyptians held the Israelites in slavery for 400 years. So for Cyrus to release these guys to go back, and then later Xerxes, Artaxerxes releasing Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. I mean, those were significant events that they all had personal connection to, because they have family history of those who had died or been taken into captivity because of what happened. So I guess, guys, again, I know some of this might seem tedious for some of you, who aren't into these kinds of things. This might seem like just taking this time to study these details and why are they significant. Well, one thing it helps us to remember, again, these guys are people that God used, that had lives and had history and had things happen to them, and we tend not to remember that. So again, think about Chronicles. What makes Chronicles a hard book to read through, at least at the beginning?
All the names.
Oh, yeah, all the names, right? But when you dig into that book, you get little pieces of information like we just saw today in First Chronicles 6. And honestly, I think that can help us again with trying to enter into the world of the people that are involved in the book. So entering Joshua's world. He's not just some distant, aloof high priest that just there's some connections. And then the author of Chronicles felt it so important that to personalize the history of the people, that he writes down all of these lists of names, these genealogies, and he spends many chapters. This is, again, Holy Spirit inspired text, right? So and it falls under the category of all scripture is God-breathed and profitable. So in some way, this has to be helpful to us. In some way, understanding these connections, knowing these names, must have some spiritual benefit for us. And so I think it's helpful when given the opportunity, like we're studying Haggai, let's look a little bit into the lives of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Because I think they are mentioned in other places, and even their descendants and their ancestors are mentioned in other places, because there's a connection. And eventually we see with Zerubbabel a connection to the messianic line, to Jesus. And even Joshua, there's a connection to Christ, isn't there? He meets Jesus. You know that, right? Or sorry, I should say another way. There's a vision of him meeting Jesus. Let me say it that way. Right? That Zechariah sees a vision of Joshua, and next to him is standing the angel of Yahweh. So this Joshua is fairly significant. I don't think I remember anyone talking about a vision with any one of you guys standing next to the Messiah, but Joshua was described in that way in one of the visions. And so all of these things, again, I think just help when we see these links and take this time to do this, it can really help us in entering into the world of the text a little better. Okay. Thoughts or comments about that? Anything come to your mind?
I like. I just what we're doing now just personalizes each of these characters, and especially in Haggai when the Lord basically first rebukes them for having stopped the construction, and Joshua was one of those who were assigned to rebuild the temple, and I could just imagine how this must have hit him. This message must have hit him as well.
Yeah, me too.
Especially with the family connections. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pastor.
Yeah, Ence.
Then the name Joshua as well is significant.
Yeah. Yeah.
How he was named Joshua, God is salvation, and it just gives us a preview of who God is and what God would do to His people in the coming of His Son. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because Jesus comes from what name?
Joshua.
Yeah, Yeshua, right? Yeah, God delivers, God saves. And so, yeah, there's some significance there, some connection there. That's why, yeah, that vision of Joshua, Yeshua, standing next to the coming Yeshua, and who cleanses Joshua, I mean, is so vividly rich in gospel imagery there, isn't it? But yeah, that's an excellent observation, right? That just his name, and it's no accident in the providence of God, having that particular name and being, one of those through whom God would have his temple rebuilt. And again, we come back to this big question that needs to stay in the forefront of our minds. Why was this temple so important to God to have rebuilt? And so just keep that question there as we go through this particular book. But Josh was one of the key players. He and Zerubbabel are both. And again, if you look back, we did this, I think, last week when we looked at Ezra together. We got to chapter 5. Maybe Harris, I'll have you read these couple verses here. Begin in chapter 4, 24, and then if you could read through chapter 5, verse 2. You'll need to unmute also.
4:24.
Yeah,
Then
420.
work in the house of God. Oh, sorry. Then work on the house of God in Jerusalem ceased, and it was stopped until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. When the prophets Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them, then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jehozadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them.
All right, so what do we see here? What's being described explicitly?
The work on the rebuilding of the temple stopped, but two prophets arose in order to encourage the people to rebuild the temple. Haggai and Zechariah, and they encouraged particularly Zerubbabel and Joshua.
Yes.
Rebuild the house of the Lord.
Good. That last thing you said is very important to realize, because it said Zerubbabel and Yeshua began to rebuild, and the prophets were supporting them, specifically Zerubbabel and Joshua. All right. And so when we get to Haggai and we see that his first message is to Zerubbabel and Joshua specifically, right? That makes sense. That's to whom, really we, don't think of all of Haggai's messages that he's he's sitting behind a pulpit, he's up there in the Temple Mount, and he brought a little pulpit with him, and he's getting ready, and he's gathered all the people, and I'm gonna deliver my sermon now. I'm gonna preach to you. No, actually, his first message was to Zerubbabel and Joshua. Could have been, I don't think it says. Let me make sure I don't misspeak, but I don't believe it says that there's anybody else there in that first message, right? The word of the Lord came to him by the prophet to Zerubbabel and to Joshua, thus says the Lord. And then, now what's interesting, of course, is the message is about the people, right? But he gives a message primarily, it says here, to the two leaders, who then they were to go and motivate the people to rebuild. But I just find it really interesting that, again, Ezra says explicitly that Haggai and Zechariah were primarily supporting Joshua and Zerubbabel in the rebuilding of the temple. And then, of course, they were the leaders, and so they would then work with the people to get it done. But there was, I think, an intentionality we see here in Haggai, where, again, 3 of the 4 messages were included Zerubbabel, were directed to Zerubbabel. And with the last message, he's the only recipient, by the way. The first message, he and Joshua are the recipients. The second message, he and Joshua are the recipients, along with the people of Judah. And then the third message, we have the priests, which, guess who is one of the priests? Right? High priest is Joshua. Okay. So certainly he would be included in that group. So if you notice here, every message basically includes or is directed to Joshua or Zerubbabel or both. And then in the second message, it includes also the people. The third message, the priests. But there seems to be a particular emphasis or focus here on Haggai's ministry being more directly connected to or involved with Joshua and Zerubbabel, the 2 leaders, which, there may be some principles there to consider as far as ministry in the church and those kinds of things. But again, let's keep that in mind, that God had raised up these 2 individuals, and they were the ones that were the primary recipients of these messages to motivate the people to do this work. Okay? We can't forget that, guys, because Zechariah, there is a vision in Zechariah, the 4th vision or the 5th one. Do you remember the menorah and the oil and the 2 was it trees that were the symbol?
Olive tree.
Yeah.
Olive trees.
And who were those guys?
Joshua and Zerubbabel.
Yeah. They were the tools, the instruments through whom God wanted the temple rebuilt. Again, don't let that escape you as you think about what is the importance of this temple. Okay? Who might, if you think about the civil leader in the line of David, the religious leader whose name is Yeshua, and the visions that Zechariah has that really center around Christ. There's some, I think, important connections here that we need to be aware of. This wasn't just, Haggai's messages weren't just a generic statement to all the people. Now, other prophets often did address all the people, right? If you look at Hosea and Joel, Amos, most of the other prophets, their message was to the people. But here in Haggai, his messages are mainly focused on those two men. Okay, I think that's an important or significant detail we want to pay attention to. So when you go through the background context, this is what flushes out of that. You see, oh, wait a minute, who's the direct audience here? It's not the people. The first message is about the people, but it's to Zerubbabel and Joshua. The second message does include the people, but it's also to Zerubbabel and Joshua. The third message is about the people, but it's directed to the high priest. And the fourth message is just to Zerubbabel. Okay? I don't mean to be redundant and repetitive, but I think when you study the background, this should surface out as like, oh, this is unique in these prophetic books. On occasion, prophets will go directly to an individual, right? Nathan went to David. At times, Jeremiah went directly to, was it Jehoiakim or Jeroboam? I forget. So you had occasion, Elijah, he would go directly to Ahab at times. So at occasion, prophets would go directly to individuals. But when you look at the prophetic books, oftentimes, especially the minor prophets, they are direct, their messages to the nation or the people. Anyway, thoughts, comments about that, observations?
Again, I'm just wondering how these two people, how this message impacted them, because they were part of vision, and they were also they were there when the temple work stopped, and so the Lord had to basically rebuke them, remind them, hey, I sent you for this, so what's happening? So I can just imagine the impact of this on them. But at the same time, we see also the grace of God, because though they were leaders who for a while stopped doing what they were supposed to do, just in Haggai, there were words of encouragement from the Lord to them. So
Yes.
I guess there are a lot of principles there as well.
Yeah, where do we see that? That's a good point. Where do we observe that in the text here? Maybe I should do it this way. This way. Right, he says, I think it's the second message, right? Take courage, Zerubbabel. Take courage, Joshua. And then he even addresses the people, take courage, I am with you. My spirit is abiding in your midst. Which, that's a significant statement, isn't it? When we think about the vision Zechariah had regarding the, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. Is that what you were thinking of though here, when you said that, Robbie?
Yes, yes. And even in chapter 2, the Lord continues to encourage them, even in the midst of the rebuke.
Yeah, we see that, you know, we see that here in these messages from Joshua, you know, as we go in more detail, where yes, there is the first message sort of is more of a rebuke, an exhortation, and then the second message is one of encouragement. And even the last message is one of encouragement as well. It's given only to Zerubbabel, but it's a very encouraging statement made by the Lord.
Hey, Pastor Tim,
Yeah, Athan.
I think it's also significant to, since Joshua was being highlighted, uh, he as the representative of the people being the high priest.
Yes.
Concerning vision in Zechariah in chapter 3, they're not only discouraged by the present sin because of the uh, delay of the rebuilding of the temple, but I believe it's also significant that these people might also feel shame because of what they have experienced from uh, their exile is because of their sins, so the sins of their people, and that might also discourage them from, in the sense of, are they worthy to to rebuild the temple? That's why in chapter 3 of Zechariah, where Satan is um, accusing Joshua, the angel of the Lord said, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." And it's just an affirmation that Joshua already cleansed, So um, my point there is the vision is again an encouragement for them not to dwell on their past sins, but to really take hold of the forgiveness and mercy of the Lord. That's why they can continue with the work of the rebuilding of the temple.
Yeah, as you're describing that, you know, the Haggai, right? The third message of Haggai that he directs to the priests, Haggai chapter 2. Sorry, this is it the third message when he asked the priest basically, you know, about holiness, and the whole point was he was illustrating that the people is unclean before him, and the work of the hands there is unclean, but they still are being commissioned to do this work. And it made me think of Zechariah 3 and exactly what you're talking about here, that it's really helpful when you study Zechariah if you have studied Haggai, because there's an interconnection between their messages. They're linked together. And so really you can see Haggai's first message is linked to Zechariah's first message. And then Haggai's second message is linked to the fourth message or fourth vision of Zechariah, the oil. And then Haggai's third message is linked to the vision of Zechariah that Athan just mentioned in Zechariah chapter 3. And then the fourth message regarding Zerubbabel, I think, is linked to Zechariah 6. And we'll get to that in another time. But there really is you really can't study Zechariah without understanding Haggai. Haggai really provides sort of a foundation. Those first messages that he delivers really provide a foundation for what we see, at least in the early chapters of Zechariah. And I think it's helpful to know before you preach through Zechariah, really, I think it's helpful to preach through Haggai, or at least study Haggai, so you have a foundation to what's going on in Zechariah. You know, Zechariah is really part two, right? These guys come together. They're commissioned together for the same purpose, right? And so, but you have Haggai, he's the one that starts. And then Zechariah sort of joins in after a few months, at least according to the biblical record. And then Zechariah takes it, you know, and extends beyond. But Haggai really provides the seeds in his messages, the seeds of what we find in Zechariah. Okay. All right, good. Any other thoughts, insights, things that come to your mind at this point?
Pastor Tim,
Yeah, Renee.
in the book of Haggai, Joshua was called Joshua, and on the other books mentioning this name, they use Jeshua. Is there a difference, or
No,
was
no, it's the
translated?
same. Technically, his name in the Hebrew is Yeshua. So sometimes the English translations use Joshua, or other times Yeshua is a more accurate translation, actually, of the Hebrew word. But Joshua sort of found its way into the translations. But yeah, that's a good observation. But they are the same guy. And you notice too, I think we read in one of the passages, it was Jeshua, son of Jozadak, not Jehozadak. Sometimes the letters are dropped. We see that with some of the kings as well. There's Jehoiachin, or he's also known as Jeconiah. So sometimes they had names that were same guy, but had a different name or different spelling or variation of it. You guys do this all the time, right? You have nicknames and you have various spellings of each other's names as well. So, but the reason we would know also specifically, Renee, is it does have in those passages Jeshua, but then it says the high priest, and then or the son of Jozadak. So we know it's talking about the same guy that we see in Haggai.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. You guys had it. You want to talk about Darius a little bit, or are you had enough? I'll leave it to you. You might end up with one of my rabbit trail stories if we keep going. So
Yeah, I think we need to absorb all of these connections that we just saw today.
okay, sounds good. We'll talk a little bit about Darius next time. We've already I did bring him up a little bit with the Behistun inscription. But when we go through social context, he's the one name that pops up, right? That's mentioned in the book. So it's helpful to understand a little bit of who he is. So Lord willing, next time we'll talk about him, a little bit about the geographical context, and then focus primarily on the occasion for the book, which I think we understand at this point, but we'll try to, Lord willing, finish up the background next week so we can dive into the author's flow of thought. And that's where we'll really give a little more time on looking at the messages, at least from a general point of view, just trying to find the author, Haggai's flow of thought. And again, thinking about, you know, what seems to be the point of each message, why were they delivered in this order? And what is it in the message that seems to be, you know, they're linked together in some way, right? They all connected to the purpose for Haggai's ministry, but I think too they're put in a particular order that is helpful to consider, you know, what the connections might be. So we'll address that in the coming weeks. My thoughts were to maybe meet again for a couple more weeks, and then middle of December, I know is a busy time for you guys as we approach Christmas. So my thoughts were at least to meet a couple more weeks together, and then take a couple weeks off during the Christmas break. But we can discuss that more next time we get together. Okay. Any final questions or comments before we wrap it up this morning? All right. Well, let me ask Harris to. Oh yeah, go ahead, Robin.
No, I just wanted to say how helpful this session was. And really, thanks for helping us put all of these together. This is a lot of work. This made us, at least made me realize how much work you have to put in the background. Again, I was just reminded of that again.
Well, good. I know some of this can, yeah, be a little tedious, some of these kinds of things, but you know, we don't know a lot, honestly. We know a lot about New Testament stuff because that's where we spend a lot of our time, but some of these Old Testament connections and background and people we're maybe a little less familiar with. So it's helpful to just keep building into our understanding and our knowledge of these things. That's how it sort of works, right? And I think how we better understand epistles, you know, as you go through them and study them, you study one and another, you begin to see connections, you know, there's historically, you know, they're linked together in different ways. And so those, as those connections, as you begin to make those connections and see those things, that really opens up sort of broader understanding of the message of each of those books. I think Philemon and Colossians is one prime example of that, where there's the links there. But, okay, thanks for that. Harris, you want to close us in prayer?